I need this painting to be over. Okay, this is how it was supposed to go. The plan was to do a quick painting and give people a nice step-by-step on how to shade. Except I'll just do a simple half-body up drawing. What could possibly go wrong? I underestimated shading. I'm so over it. I underestimated color. But I learned so much during the process. I made many mistakes along the way, but I'll try to explain them so that you won't make them. Enjoy my suffering, I guess. Quick review on shading. Start by determining the light source. The planes that face towards the light are in light, and the planes that face away from the light are in shadow. So like this? Hey, why doesn't this work? Look at these photos. Reality is actually sort of cel-shaded. You can see that the light and shadow areas are clearly separate. And yeah, sure, there are other lighting scenarios. There's ambient lighting, there's overcast lighting, studio lighting, multiple light sources. But let's start with the most straightforward first. One clearly defined light source, like the sun. We can also start working in some cast shadows. Think about where the light might be blocked by some other objects. This cell shading step is important because it's where we define our overall shadow shapes. Probably want to make sure that you don't zoom in too far when you're doing your initial cell shading. Because when you're cell shading, you want to focus on the big shapes first to make sure your overall composition is readable. Once we're done with that, we can also add some intermediate shades in the light and shadows by thinking about the directions of the planes. But try to maintain those shapes you defined during the cell shading step. So where is the darkest part of the shadow? It's actually on the edge of the shadow. This is called a core shadow. But why is that? So there's something called ambient light, or also known as reflected light. Even if you're working with a single light source, that light source can bounce off other objects or surfaces and back to your subject. In an outside setting like this painting, the ambient light from the sky is gonna be everywhere. Okay, now it's time for some ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is different from other kinds of shadows in that it doesn't have much to do with the direction of your main light source. It's like a very dark shadow that occurs when two surfaces are really close together. Light bounces into this little crevice, but it can't get back out, and it can't get to your eyes. This helps create depth and adds realism to your painting, except mistake number one. My value range is too high. There's too much contrast here, especially in the so-called ambient occlusion under the shawl. That's not even really ambient occlusion. The most obvious ones are the ones that go underneath the cape here. Ambient occlusion should be used sparingly for surfaces that actually come close to touching, and they don't have to be this dark. So this specific problem is called a shadow within a shadow, or a double shadow.
Oh my god.
You don't want there to be too much variation in the brightness in your lights or your shadows. This can make your composition messy and hard to read, which makes it harder to focus the viewer's attention on the things you actually want. Okay, let's add some local color, which is the true color of things if you ignore lighting. Nothing too much, we're just adding a little bit of color here and there. You can also airbrush in some gradients, for example, on the lips or the knuckles. Okay, now that that's done, remember those shadows we painted in? Now we can set that shadow layer to multiply and shading jump scare. This doesn't look good. They're gray and dull, and skin simply does not look like that when it's in sunlight. Hey, no worries. All you have to do is add a new color layer on top of your shadow layer to color your shadows. But what color are shadows actually? It really depends, but usually two things determine the color of your shadow. One, the color of your lights. Usually the shadow colors are the complementary of the light color. That is the opposite side of the color wheel. That means a yellow light will have a blue shadow, or a red light will have a green shadow. Number two, the color of the ambient light or reflected light. In this situation, lots of light will be bouncing off the sky and there's going to be blue light everywhere coloring the shadow. So we could just make the shadows blue, right? And there you go. That is way too blue, but we can play around with this. Oh, but having blue shadows on this specific skin tone looks washed out, so we can just make it reddish instead. Mistake number two. So I've basically been using this process for simple stylized coloring this entire time, right? And that's worked fine. But I failed to take into account that my favorite genre of drawing is character stands in white void. I pretty much never paint full scenes, so I have no idea what possessed me to do that today. And painting light and shadow is a lot more complicating when you're placing a character in the scene. Using my usual blue and red shadow colors just didn't work here. In the end, I just looked at some references and just did trial and error until I got something I was happy with. So I'll start with a kind of a reddish hue like this and see how that looks. That seems to be a bit too much. Not exactly very efficient, and I ended up choosing a pinkish purplish shade for everything in the end, so I didn't even follow my own rule. So we talked about ambient light a few times, but it's time to finally paint it on. When you're working on reflected light, it's a good chance to get some hue shifts in, so I like to make a new layer and just paint on top. In this painting, I make my reflected light kind of bluish to reflect how the ambient light is mostly blue. You can also pay attention to nearby surfaces that reflect light. This gem here is really bright red, so it might reflect some red light onto the hair here. Adds a level of like dynamism, realism. It just looks cool. Make sure not to overdo it like I just did. Make sure not to make your reflected light too bright. Keep the lightest portion of the shadow darker than the darkest portion of the light. To check this, you could turn your image into grayscale to make sure that the image still reads clearly. One way of doing this is to make a new layer, fill it with black, and set the blending mode to saturation. It's not an exact match with the perceptual brightness of the colors, which is a topic so complicated that it probably warrants its own video, but it's a good enough approximation for now. Anyway, it's time to move on to painting the background elements. I didn't really think too much about this, but I think there needs to be more interest at the bottom down here. So maybe I will add some trees or mountains down here. To be honest, I don't really know what I'm doing here. I'm thinking she's standing in a flower field full of blue flowers, so I had some trees, clouds, flying flower petals, but then mistake number 3. I felt fine about her face while I was sketching it, or even the line art phase, but while I was rendering it, it just felt off. I couldn't get things to look right. I wasn't happy with the face, but I had no idea how to fix it until Fua came to the rescue. She gave me a paint over and showed me that actually, this character's skull was just way too long and her hairline was pushed way too far back. Which is why people kept making remarks about how she was looking a little bald, and in my hubris, I just chose not to perceive those comments. I am so grateful for this, and she made the illustration so much better. Having other people with fresh eyes come look at your work can be extremely valuable. If you've been working on something for a while, your eyes just kind of get used to what you're seeing, and spotting errors can get really difficult. But anyway, with her help, I think I managed to make the character's face look a little bit more anatomical, believable, and appealing. I'm so happy, it looks so much better. I was so upset because I was like, I can't figure out what's wrong. When it comes to anime girls, the most important part is the face. After all, thank you once again for all your help. I continue working on the background and overall composition, and with some help from Mario, I adjust the sky a little bit so that the readability is improved. I think we can start painting over everything now. It's a little scary though, so let me think about it for a second first. Okay, here we go. Merge selected layers. Boom. One Frieren. Right here. At this point, I've merged all the layers of the character, and I'm painting on top of it, refining it, and cleaning up the messy brushstrokes. But now, it's time for mistake number 4. These fingers have an extra joint. Holy moly! I'm literally AI. Just look at these hands. The knuckle is down here, so that means that this finger has 3 joints. I cannot believe I didn't see this earlier. Looking back at my earlier sketches, the finger looked fine, but I somehow managed to completely mess it up during the line art phase. I managed to resolve it with Mae's help, thanks to this paint over. I also tried to make the fingers more elegant and smoother, but honestly, drawing hands is seriously not my forte. This hand is gonna be the death of me, isn't it? So I refine the fingers until I'm satisfied and move on to cleaning up the torso until mistake number 5. Once again, I'm painting shadows within the shadow. Oh wait, this is just mistake number 1 again, actually, but I keep doing it. I got so caught up in trying to render and refine, I ended up just making the shadows too dark again. I want the focal point to be on her flower, but since there's just so much going on, it's hard to make out. Thanks again to Fua for pointing this out. I just put a normal layer with low opacity on top of the whole torso, bringing the values there closer together. The brighter colors become darker, and the darker colors become brighter. Lowering the contrast there really makes the flower stand out more. Just look at the before and after. Look. Oh, that is a pretty big improvement. I'm saved! Yep, I'm gonna merge it down. As a final touch, I add a little bit of subsurface scattering, which is when light penetrates a translucent object, bounces around a little bit inside, and then bounces back out of the object. Some people shorten it by saying subsurface scat. And I'm like, I'm not sure if you should say it like that. Yeah, no, I'm like, no, not the subsurface scat. Please take it easy. Oh my god, I have too many toggles on going on. I gotta fix them. In the case of skin, this makes a red glowy effect when you hold your fingers up to the light. You can see where I've already painted this in. Here I've made the edges of the light a vibrant pink color, or here in the ear, where it's thinner, and the light can come through it. I also add a little bit on the neck, and add the saturated pink color on the fingertips and knuckles in particular, since there are a lot of blood vessels concentrated there, so the subsurface scattering effect is extra prominent. Wow, fingertips are glowy. That's so fun. Now I spend a little bit more time touching up the flower and the eyes, since I know they will be the main focal point of this painting. Clean up the background and we're done. I sign my name and add a noise overlay on top for some texture. And of course, the last thing to do is I'm gonna put in a really witty title here, which is Frieren, and post it. Done. Okay, now I don't look at it anymore. Whoops, I realized the noise texture is a little too strong. Unpost the social media. I changed my mind. Okay, that's better. It was a bit too much, I think. Like, wow. Okay, for real this time. There. So I unpost it right away, reduce the noise layer, and post it again. Nobody saw that, right? Of course, I don't notice that I've accidentally dragged my signature somewhere completely random before exporting the image, but oh well, I can pretend that's on purpose, maybe? So the painting is done. But does that mean there are things I couldn't improve on? No, of course not. But the illustration is finished, and even if I notice things that could be made better, I can reflect on them and keep them in mind for my next piece. It's better than noodling on a piece endlessly because there's always something you can do better. For instance, I feel my brushwork and blending is a little subpar. I don't need everything to be perfectly smooth, but I feel like I could have paid more attention to making my strokes more deliberate. I feel like my hands could still use some work. They look more or less like hands, but I could have improved the gesture and shape of them to make them look more elegant. The fingers just look a bit too boxy for me. I also struggled a lot on the face. That just shows I should spend more time studying the anatomy and structure of the head. And I still had the double shadow problem where the value range in my shadows is too high. I tried my best to fix it, but I definitely need to pay more attention to that for my next painting. Honestly, there's probably still way more things I could fix, I'm just not good enough to see them yet. But even though I can see all the flaws clearly, that doesn't mean I'm sad that my painting isn't as good as I wanted. I'm happy that I got to learn a lot from it. This painting is just a single step on my journey as an artist, and I'm excited to implement all the things I learned for my next painting. Remember, just because you do a bad drawing doesn't mean you're a bad person. So that's it. And I'm sorry I couldn't do a nice straightforward shading tutorial like I planned to. Painting like this just showed me there's a lot I need to learn about color and shading before I can even think about doing something like that. But let me know if there's anything you'd like to see from me. I can't promise I'm good enough to teach you, but I can at least try. Thanks for watching, and remember to have fun. What could possibly go wrong? And the answer is everything. What else? Keep the darkest dark lord darkening dark. One day I'll paint something else. That's my goal for 2024. To paint something that looks good without hand holding me.